Michael Turner's life seems perfect. Steady job, loving wife, and a quiet suburban home. But when a late-night phone call shatters his world, he uncovers a betrayal that leaves him questioning everything. Emily, his wife, has been having an affair with a yoga instructor, and Michael is left to confront the lies and deceit that have been hidden right in front of him. As Michael seeks the truth, he is forced to face the woman he loved and decide whether to confront his past or walk away for good. The choice will change everything. What will Michael do next? If you enjoy these types of stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss the next chapter. Now, let's get into it. It's early spring, 2023. The air still has that cool bite to it, but you can feel the promise of warmer days ahead. This story is set in the kind of suburban town where things always seem just a little too perfect on the surface. The streets are lined with neatly manicured lawns, picket fences, and well-kept homes. But of course, we all know the truth, right? Nothing is ever as perfect as it seems. Meet Michael Turner, 38, a middle management guy with a steady job in finance. He's the kind of person who always did everything by the book. Never a big risk taker, not a wild one by any means. He's got a stable life. His wife, Emily, a 35-year-old high school teacher, a dog, a modest but charming house, and a life that seemed, at least from the outside, to be pretty normal. But as we all know, normal is just a setup for something to shake things up. Michael had always been a bit of a workaholic, but things were fine, right? He and Emily had their routines, their little moments of joy, movie nights, Sunday morning coffee, the occasional weekend getaway. Life was predictable, comfortable, and for the most part, that's all he needed. After all, Emily was his rock. She was his balance, the calm to his chaos. Or, that's what he thought. One Thursday evening, Emily left for a girls' night out with a couple of friends from her book club. Nothing unusual about it. She was always so full of life when she went out with her friends, talking about the books they were reading, or the latest drama in their lives. But tonight, things would be different. Michael had been caught up with work, as usual. He didn't even think twice when Emily kissed him goodbye at the door, a little too quickly, but he wrote it off. She was probably excited about the night ahead. A couple of hours passed, and he finished up the report he'd been working on. His phone buzzed once or twice, but when he looked, it was nothing important. Just work emails. No text from Emily, but that didn't strike him as odd either. Maybe she was too busy, caught up in conversation, or just enjoying her time out. Around midnight, Michael sent Emily a text. "How's the night going?" No reply. At first, he figured she was having too much fun. He could picture her laughing with her friends, a glass of wine in hand, the kind of carefree moments he always loved hearing about when she came home. But as time dragged on, the silence started to feel different. Emily wasn't one to leave him hanging on a text. She'd always reply, even if it was just a quick, "All good, I'll be home soon." He sent another message around 1 a.m. "Everything okay?" Still, nothing. Now, Michael wasn't a paranoid guy, but he started to feel a weird unease settling in. It was strange. He decided to give her a little more time before getting too worried. But around 2 a.m., the thought of her not being home and not even hearing from her gnawed at him. Something wasn't right. He tried calling. The phone rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. That's when it hit him. What if something had happened? Maybe there was an accident. Or worse. He immediately thought about all the things that could have gone wrong. Things he never let himself entertain before. What if she was in trouble and couldn't reach out? His heart raced as the worst-case scenarios flooded his mind. What if... Just as Michael was about to send another message, his phone rang. The caller ID flashed, "Unknown number." His stomach tightened, and he answered the phone, his voice a little hoarse. "Hello?" A calm voice on the other end introduced himself. "Is this Michael Turner?" "Yes," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm Officer Stevens from the police department," the voice continued. "We found your wife, Emily. She's been in an accident." Michael's blood ran cold. He felt the room start to spin, the words barely registering. "What happened? Is she okay?" "She's alive, but I need you to come down to Memorial Hospital right away. We'll brief you when you arrive," Officer Stevens said, his tone professional but firm. Michael hung up, his heart racing. He barely registered the frantic steps as he pulled on a jacket and grabbed his car keys. Something was very wrong. 1,000 thoughts shot through his mind. An accident. Emily wasn't the reckless type. She didn't drink too much, and she always texted him when she was on her way home. He couldn't waste another second. The drive to the hospital was a blur, the streets empty at this hour, the flickering streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. His mind raced. What was going on? Why wouldn't she answer her phone? Why was the police calling him? The hospital's parking lot felt empty as he pulled in, the bright white lights harsh against the dark sky. He stepped out of the car, his hands shaking slightly as he rushed toward the entrance. The emergency room was busy, with nurses and doctors hurrying past, their faces filled with focused determination. A nurse behind the reception desk looked up as he approached, her tired eyes softening when she saw his distress. "Can I help you?" she asked, already typing on her keyboard. "My wife, Emily Turner," he said, his voice strained. "I just got a call. The police said she's here. What happened?" The nurse nodded. She didn't seem surprised, but gave him a small, sympathetic look. "Please have a seat. Dr. Green will be out to speak with you shortly." Michael didn't want to sit. The waiting room was almost empty. Just a few patients scattered around, dozing or flipping through magazines. His hands were trembling, and his mind was still racing. What was going on with Emily? Why hadn't she come home? He couldn't sit still. The minutes felt like hours as he paced the room, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, a tall man in a white coat walked into the room. "Dr. Green," his name tag read. "Mr. Turner?" Dr. Green asked, his voice calm but with a trace of tension Michael couldn't quite place. "Yes, that's me," Michael replied, standing up quickly, eager for answers. "Follow me," Dr. Green said, gesturing down the hall. Michael followed him down a narrow corridor, his steps echoing off the polished floors. Dr. Green led him to a quiet corner where they could speak privately. "Your wife is in stable condition, Mr. Turner," Dr. Green began, clearly choosing his words carefully. "She was found in an alley behind a local bar. We're still trying to piece together exactly what happened, but she was unconscious when we brought her in. We're doing everything we can." Is she going to be okay?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The fear in his chest was growing. Dr. Green nodded, but the look on his face didn't reassure Michael. "She's alive, but we need to run some more tests. I'll update you as soon as we know more." Michael's mind was racing again. A bar. Emily wasn't the type to hang out in bars late at night. What was she doing there? He wanted to ask more questions, but the doctor gave him a gentle nod and turned away, disappearing down the hallway. Michael stood there, staring at the sterile walls, trying to make sense of the situation. Everything he thought he knew about his wife, his life, was suddenly being called into question. Emily wasn't a drinker. She wasn't someone who would be out at some bar in the middle of the night, no matter what kind of day she'd had. As the minutes dragged on, his mind kept returning to one thing. The phone call. Why had she been at a bar? Why was she unconscious? Was she with someone? He wasn't sure how much longer he could wait. Michael sat in the sterile waiting room, every moment feeling like it stretched longer than the last. His thoughts kept spiraling back to one thing. Emily. What had happened to her? What had she been doing in that alley behind a bar? And more importantly, why hadn't she called him, let him know she was okay? He tried to focus on the doctor's words, trying to make sense of everything. He kept telling himself that Emily was strong, she'd be okay. But the unease gnawing at him wouldn't let go. He glanced around the room, but nothing seemed to make sense in that moment. His mind was cluttered with questions, doubts, and fear. And then, as if in slow motion, a new figure entered the waiting room. A woman, short, with dark hair pulled back into a neat ponytail, wearing a police uniform. She was young, maybe early 30s, but her expression was serious as she approached him. "Mr. Turner?" she asked, her voice calm but with a professional edge that made Michael's heart skip a beat. "I'm Officer Taylor. I'm here to speak with you about your wife." Michael stood up instantly, a sense of dread creeping over him. "What happened to Emily?" His voice cracked as he asked. Officer Taylor nodded slightly, acknowledging his distress. "I can't give you all the details just yet, but we're investigating what happened tonight. It seems your wife was with someone before she ended up at the bar. We have reason to believe she wasn't alone." That hit Michael like a punch to the gut. His brain had already been trying to process the idea of Emily being in trouble, but this was a whole new level of confusion. Who could she have been with? He tried to keep his face neutral, but inside, his mind was racing. Who was she with? Why didn't she tell him about it? "Is she going to be okay?" Michael asked again, his voice barely a whisper. "She's stable, as I mentioned, but we need to know what happened in those hours leading up to her being found," Officer Taylor said. "There's something off about the whole situation, Mr. Turner. We'll be in touch once we have more information." Before Michael could respond, Officer Taylor walked away, leaving him to stew in his thoughts. More questions piled on top of the ones he already had. What was off about the situation, and who was Emily with? Could it be a colleague, a friend, or something else entirely? He could feel his emotions shifting from confusion to anger, and then back to fear, swirling inside him like a storm. His thoughts were interrupted when Dr. Green returned to the waiting room. "Mr. Turner," he said, his tone unchanged, but there was a slight hesitancy in his voice. "You can see your wife now. We've moved her to a more stable room." Michael nodded and followed Dr. Green down another hallway. His steps felt heavier now. He wasn't sure what to expect when he walked in there, but he knew one thing for sure. Things would never be the same again. Emily had always been his rock, the person who understood him without saying a word. But now, something about her had changed, and he wasn't sure if he could ever go back to the way things were. As they approached her room, Michael's heart pounded in his chest. The door opened slowly, and he stepped inside. Emily was lying in bed, her face pale but peaceful. Her breathing was steady, and she seemed to be sleeping. But Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He took a seat beside her bed, watching her for a few moments, his hands clasped tightly together. She looked so fragile, and yet so far away. It felt like they were strangers. His thoughts were interrupted when Emily stirred slightly. Her eyelids fluttered open, and she blinked as her eyes tried to focus on him. "Michael," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You're here." Her words hit him hard, but the confusion still lingered in his mind. She seemed so calm, almost too calm. Shouldn't she be panicked? Shouldn't she be asking questions? What happened to her tonight? Why was she acting so distant? "Emily, what happened?" His voice was gentle but filled with urgency. "Why didn't you come home? Why didn't you call me?" She blinked again, her brow furrowing slightly. Then, she sighed, the weariness evident in her expression. I didn't want to worry you. It was nothing." "Nothing," Michael repeated, his frustration growing. "You're here in the hospital, Emily. How can you say it's nothing?" She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to gather her thoughts. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet, almost as if she was afraid to say the wrong thing. "I got drunk," she said simply. "I lost track of time. I wasn't thinking straight." Michael looked at her, still processing the situation. A part of him wanted to believe her, but another part of him felt like there was more she wasn't saying. "Who were you with, Emily?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Why didn't you tell me?" She looked down, her hands fidgeting with the hospital blanket. "It's not what you think," she whispered, as though trying to convince herself as much as him. "I wasn't with anyone, Michael. I don't know what happened. I don't remember." Michael felt his stomach turn. He wanted to believe her, but there was something in her eyes that said she was hiding something. She wasn't being completely honest with him, and that thought alone made him feel like the ground was slipping away from him. Before he could say anything else, a nurse came in to check on Emily, disrupting their conversation. Michael stood up, trying to keep his composure, but inside, he felt like his world was unraveling. As the nurse adjusted the IV and checked Emily's vitals, Michael's mind kept racing. What was she hiding? And why couldn't she just tell him the truth? Something was off, and he knew it. But he didn't know where to go from here. He needed answers, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could sit by, waiting for the truth to come to light. The next few days were a blur. Emily was recovering physically, but emotionally, she seemed distant. She was quiet, her usual warm smile replaced by a cold, almost uncomfortable expression. She kept insisting that nothing had happened, that it was just a mistake, a night out that got out of hand. But Michael knew better. There were too many gaps in her story, too many things that didn't add up. One evening, after Emily had gone to bed early, Michael sat alone in the living room, replaying everything in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was being hidden from him. Emily had been so open with him before. They had always shared everything. But now, there was a wall between them, and it was driving him mad. Then, a thought crossed his mind. What if the answers were right in front of him? What if all he had to do was look in the one place Emily had always guarded so carefully? Her phone. He stood up, his heart racing as he walked toward the kitchen where her phone lay on the counter. He hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should go through her things. But then, the silence in the house felt too heavy, and he knew he had to know the truth. He grabbed the phone and unlocked it with the passcode he'd always known. The screen flashed to life, and Michael scrolled through the messages, the weight of each swipe getting heavier. What he found next would change everything. Michael sat on the couch, his hands shaking slightly as he unlocked Emily's phone. His heart was pounding in his chest. He couldn't believe what he was about to do. But there was no turning back now. He needed answers. The messages loaded on the screen in front of him, each one more damning than the last. He scrolled through several conversations, but the name that kept popping up sent a chill down his spine. Andrew. Michael paused, his finger hovering over the screen. His gut told him this was the person Emily had been with that night, the person she refused to mention. He kept scrolling, each message sending a new wave of betrayal through him. One message read, "Last night was incredible. I can't wait until we're alone again. I feel so free with you." Another message followed. "I love how he doesn't even notice. He really believes I'm at book club. It's so easy." The bile rose in Michael's throat as he read the words. His chest tightened with anger and confusion. This wasn't just a casual fling, this was an affair, a secret life Emily had been hiding from him. There was no doubt in his mind now she had betrayed him. The trust they'd built over the years. Gone, shattered, broken into 1,000 pieces. He dropped the phone on the coffee table, his hands trembling. His mind was racing. He had been right all along. Something was off. But this was more than he could have ever imagined. The woman he thought he knew, the woman he trusted with everything, had been lying to him for who knew how long. But it wasn't just the affair that hurt the most. It was the fact that Emily had been so careful, so deliberate with her lies. The thought of her laughing with Andrew about how easy it was to deceive him made Michael feel sick to his stomach. The next few days were a blur of emotions. Michael barely spoke to Emily. Every time he looked at her, his mind replayed the messages he had read. He couldn't look at her the same way anymore. The warmth in her eyes, the smile she once gave him so freely. It all felt like a mask now. And every time she spoke, it felt like her words were empty, hollow. Emily seemed to notice the distance between them, but she didn't address it. Instead, she kept pushing, acting as if nothing was wrong, as if they could just go back to the way things were before. But Michael wasn't the same man anymore. He couldn't go back. The hurt and betrayal had consumed him. He wasn't sure what he wanted anymore. Revenge, closure, justice. But one thing was certain. He couldn't continue living in this lie. It was a Sunday when everything came to a head. Emily had spent the day out with her friends, probably working on damage control. Michael stayed home, stewing in his own thoughts, his mind running wild with every possibility. He kept thinking about Andrew. Who was this guy? How long had he been part of Emily's life? What else had she hidden from him? Around late afternoon, Emily came home. She walked in through the front door, a smile on her face. "Hey, how was your day?" she asked, her tone casual, as if nothing had changed. Michael didn't answer right away. He stood up from the couch, his eyes locking onto hers. The smile faded from her face when she saw the look in his eyes. He wasn't angry. At least not yet. but the sadness in his gaze was enough to make her nervous. "Where were you?" he asked quietly, his voice steady but filled with an unspoken weight. Emily blinked, confused. "I told you I was with my friends." "Really?" Michael's voice tightened. "Because I don't believe you anymore, Emily. You've lied to me for so long, and I don't even know who you are anymore." Her expression faltered. For the first time since everything had started, Michael saw a crack in her facade, but she quickly recovered, putting on a defensive mask. "What's this about, Michael? You're being ridiculous." "No," he said, his voice growing stronger, more confident. "I'm not. You've been hiding things from me. Things I deserve to know. You've been sleeping with someone else, and I know all about it. Andrew, your yoga instructor. The one you've been meeting behind my back, the one you've been texting, laughing about how I wouldn't even notice." Emily's face drained of color. She took a step back, her eyes wide with shock. I don't know what you're talking about. This isn't true." Michael shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Don't lie to me, Emily. I know everything. I read your messages, the ones where you talk about sneaking around behind my back. You've been with him for months, and I never even suspected a thing." "Michael, please," she said, her voice trembling. "It's not like that. You don't understand. We were just friends. It was a mistake I regret." Michael's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to yell at her, to scream, but he held himself back. He didn't need to do that anymore. He had the truth, the whole truth. And that truth was enough to destroy everything they had. "No," he said, his voice cold, hard. "It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. Every time you saw him, every time you lied to me, every time you pushed me aside for him, it was a choice. And you made that choice over and over again." Emily's eyes welled with tears, but Michael wasn't going to let her guilt trip him anymore. "Don't cry now," he spat. "You had every chance to come clean. You had every chance to be honest with me, but you didn't. You chose him. You chose to destroy everything we had." She collapsed onto the couch, her hands covering her face as she sobbed. "I'm so sorry, Michael. I never meant for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. But I did. And I don't know how to fix it." Michael stood there, his chest heaving with emotion. "It's too late for that," he said. "You can't fix what you've broken." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Emily behind in her tears. But this wasn't the end. No. This was just the beginning of a long journey, one that would push Michael to his limits. It was time for him to make a decision, to choose the path he would take. Revenge, forgiveness, or something else entirely. The days after that confrontation felt like an endless spiral of confusion and rage. Michael had demanded answers, but Emily still couldn't give him a full, honest one. She seemed broken, physically, emotionally, and mentally. But her apologies felt hollow, like they were being said just to end the conversation. It was clear to Michael that nothing would ever be the same again. Every moment they spent together felt more like a performance than a relationship. Emily tried her best to act normal, but Michael saw through it. The crack in their relationship had grown into an unbridgeable chasm, and there was no pretending it didn't exist anymore. But what hurt the most wasn't just the affair. It was the betrayal of trust. Emily had made him feel like a fool, like he was blind to the lies and the deceit. And now, as the days dragged on, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was running out of time to make a decision. The more he thought about it, the more his resentment grew. He needed to take control. He wasn't going to let her continue to pull him around by the strings. Then, the phone call came. It was the one thing Michael had been dreading, and, at the same time, secretly hoping for. Andrew Mitchell had called. At first, Michael didn't pick up. His hand hovered over the screen, his thumb unsure. He hadn't spoken to Andrew directly, but he had seen his name more times than he cared to admit. He'd seen the messages, the intimate words, the promises. The man who had become the symbol of his wife's betrayal was now trying to make contact. And Michael was torn. Did he answer? Did he let this man speak? Or did he cut him off completely? He couldn't bring himself to answer the call immediately. Instead, he sat there, the phone buzzing in his hand. The longer he waited, the more his mind twisted with every possible scenario. The voice on the other end could be one of an apology, an explanation, or worse, more lies. But then, As if the universe had decided for him, the phone stopped ringing. A voicemail appeared on the screen. Michael's pulse quickened as he pressed play. "Michael," Andrew's voice came through, steady, but with an edge that told Michael the man was already anticipating what would come next. "I know this isn't easy. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, but there's something you need to hear from me. I think you deserve to know everything. About Emily, about us. I'll be at the old diner on Oak Street tonight, 8 p.m. If you want answers, you'll find them there." Michael's grip on the phone tightened, as his mind raced. Oak Street was a part of town that wasn't particularly dangerous, but it wasn't the kind of place where people met for peaceful conversations either. He didn't know what to expect, but the idea of confronting Andrew face to face gnawed at him. What if this was the closure he needed, or what if this was just another trick? A part of him wanted to refuse, but another part of him felt like he had no choice. He needed to know the truth. All of it. That night, Michael stood outside the diner on Oak Street, staring at the neon sign flickering overhead. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Its vintage charm was clearly not enough to keep it afloat in the changing city, but tonight, it felt strangely fitting. It was as if the past, the lies, and the broken trust had led him here, to this place of uncertainty and confrontation. He pushed the door open and stepped inside, the scent of coffee and old grease hitting him instantly. The diner was nearly empty, save for a couple of late-night workers seated in a booth in the back corner. And then he saw him, Andrew. He was sitting in the farthest booth, his back to the door. Michael's stomach churned. The man was exactly as he had imagined, well-dressed, confident, but there was a coldness to his demeanor that sent an immediate signal to Michael that he wasn't here to apologize. Andrew turned as Michael approached, his eyes meeting his with an intensity that Michael couldn't shake. Without a word, Michael sat across from him. He didn't want pleasantries. He didn't want a drawn-out conversation. He wanted answers. "So, here we are," Andrew said, leaning back in his seat. "I'm assuming you got my message." "You've been with my wife for months," Michael said, his voice low but seething with barely controlled anger. "Tell me why. What's the point of all this? Why not just end it, Andrew? What do you want from me?" Andrew's lips curled into a slight smirk, and for a moment, Michael wanted to reach across the table and slap it off his face. But instead, he stayed still, listening. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," Andrew began, his tone softening just a little. "At first, Emily and we were just talking. You know, she was dealing with some things, and I was there. We shared a connection, and it just happened." Michael stared at him, disbelief and rage burning through him. "So, it was all just some connection? Huh? You don't even have the decency to call it what it was." Andrew's eyes narrowed, and his tone hardened. "I'm not here to make excuses, Michael. I'm telling you the truth. I didn't go into this thinking I'd destroy your marriage. I never set out to hurt anyone." "But you did," Michael shot back, his voice trembling with the anger that was threatening to overwhelm him. "You had no problem sneaking around behind my back. You've been lying to me, to her, using her, playing with her, and now you're sitting here like you didn't do anything wrong." Andrew didn't flinch, but Michael could see the guilt in his eyes, flickering like a weak light trying to fight through the darkness. "You're right," Andrew said, almost in a whisper. "I've been selfish, but I'm not the one who ruined everything. Emily made her choices too. I just gave her the attention she needed." Michael's fists clenched at the table. He wanted to shout at him, to tear him apart for everything he'd done. But instead, he sat there, breathing deeply, trying to collect himself. "You're right," Michael said after a long pause, his voice now controlled but thick with emotion. "She made her choices, but so did I. And I'm done with both of you." The words were out of his mouth before he even realized what they meant. He wasn't just talking about leaving this diner or this confrontation. No. Michael was talking about walking away from everything. The marriage, the trust, the life he had once known. Andrew sat back, his eyes widening slightly as if he hadn't expected that answer. Michael stood up, his heart heavy, his mind still spinning. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let this betrayal consume him any longer. As Michael walked out of the diner, he realized that he had made a decision, a painful, gut-wrenching decision. But it was his decision to make. And now, He was ready to take back control of his life, whatever that meant. Michael didn't look back as he walked out of the diner, the night air cool against his skin, but inside, he was burning with a mix of emotions, anger, betrayal, and perhaps beneath it all, a raw, aching sense of freedom. He had done it, confronted the man who had torn apart his world, but that didn't feel like the end. No, it felt like the beginning of something even more difficult. He had made his decision. There was no going back now, but the hardest part was still ahead. How could he face Emily? How could he look her in the eye and pretend to believe anything she said ever again? His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his spiraling thoughts. He fumbled to pull it out, expecting it to be a text from Andrew, maybe more words of explanation or a final attempt to ease his guilt, but instead, it was a message from Emily. "I need to see you. Please, we need to talk." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He knew this conversation was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. He wasn't sure if he was ready to go back to her, to face the woman who had destroyed everything. But he knew that, whether he was ready or not, he couldn't run from this. He couldn't run from what was left of their life together. The weight of their marriage, the memories, the promises, was far heavier than the anger he felt now. The decision was made, but how he faced the aftermath would shape who he became. Michael drove back to the house, each turn in the road feeling like an eternity. When he pulled into the driveway, he saw her car, parked just outside. The house looked the same, but it felt different. Nothing felt the same anymore. He opened the door to find Emily sitting on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor. She didn't look up when he entered, but he could feel the tension in the air. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, like a thick blanket smothering everything they'd once shared. Finally, Emily looked up, her eyes filled with tears that she seemed desperate to hold back. "Michael," she said quietly, "I'm so sorry. I know I've hurt you. I don't know how to fix this, but I need you to know that I never meant to destroy everything we built. I love you, I always have." Her voice trembled as she spoke, and for a moment, Michael felt a pang of something. Maybe empathy, maybe sadness, but it was fleeting. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough. "You love me?" Michael repeated, his voice a little rough. "You love me, and you've been sleeping with another man for months. You've been lying to me, hiding everything from me, and now you expect me to just believe that it's all just a mistake?" Her face contorted in pain, and her hands shook as she reached out for him. "It wasn't like that, Michael. I didn't mean for it to get this far. It was a mistake. I was confused, and I made a terrible choice, but I never stopped loving you, I swear." He shook his head, stepping back as he ran a hand through his hair. "No, you can't do this, Emily. You can't just say that everything's fine because you're sorry. You've destroyed everything we had. How do you expect me to just forget that, to believe you again?" The anger in his chest flared again, hot and sharp. He wanted to yell, to scream at her for everything she had done, for everything she had hidden from him. But instead, he stood there, his fists clenched at his sides, struggling to keep his composure. Emily's eyes welled with fresh tears, and she stood up, her voice cracking as she spoke again. "I don't know what else to say. I never meant for any of this to happen. It's all my fault, and I know that. But Michael, I don't want to lose you. Please don't leave me." For a long time, Michael said nothing. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of the storm of emotions inside him. Part of him wanted to forgive her, to try and salvage what little was left of their marriage. But another part of him was done. Completely and utterly done. He couldn't go back to a life where everything felt like a lie. "I can't do this anymore," he finally said, his voice steady but final. "I can't keep living in this. I can't pretend like I don't know what's been happening. I'm done, Emily." Her face crumpled at his words, and she reached out toward him, but Michael stepped away, shaking his head. He couldn't touch her. He couldn't hold her anymore, not when every part of him was telling him to walk away. "You have to leave," Michael said, his voice low but firm. "I need space. I need time to figure this out. I can't be here with you anymore." The silence between them was suffocating as Emily stood there, staring at him in shock and disbelief. Her lips trembled, and the tears flowed freely now. "I'll go," she whispered. "I'll go. But please don't say it's over." Michael didn't answer. He just turned and walked out of the room, his heart heavy, but resolute. He knew this was the right thing to do. The pain was too great, the betrayal too deep. He couldn't be with someone who had lied to him for so long, and he couldn't keep living in a marriage that had been built on a foundation of deception. As he stepped into the kitchen, he grabbed his jacket and left through the back door, stepping into the cool night air. He had to get away. Away from the house, away from Emily, away from everything. But the journey wasn't over. No, this was just another step in Michael's path to reclaiming his life. He was ready to find himself again, ready to move on. The next few days were a whirlwind. Emily moved out. The house, once filled with memories of their life together, now felt empty, almost suffocating. Michael threw himself into work, trying to keep his mind occupied. But the loneliness was deafening. He found himself questioning everything. How had he missed the signs? Had Emily ever truly loved him? Or was it all just an illusion? One night, while he was sitting alone in his apartment, he received another call. This time, it was from Emily. He stared at the phone for a moment, torn. Should he answer? Was there anything left to say? He hit the answer button. As Michael sat in his small apartment, his phone still pressed to his ear, he could barely process the words Emily was saying. His mind had already made the decision, but hearing her voice one more time brought it all back. The love, the betrayal, the shattered trust. "Michael, please!" Emily's voice cracked, desperate. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I don't know how to fix it, but I love you, I always have." The words were the same as before, and they didn't carry the weight they once did. Michael had listened to these same apologies countless times, each one feeling more empty than the last. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before speaking. "I know you're sorry, Emily, but this isn't something I can just move past. It's not just about what you did, it's about what you didn't do. You didn't trust me enough to be honest, and that's something I can never forgive." The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. Michael could picture her, sitting in some unfamiliar place, her face buried in her hands, trying to find the right words, but there were no more words left to say. "I'm sorry," she whispered, almost too quietly to hear. "I never meant to hurt you." Michael nodded, though he knew she couldn't see him. "I know you didn't, but that doesn't change what happened. I need to move on, Emily. We both do." He paused for a moment, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. "Goodbye, Emily." And with that, he ended the call. He didn't feel a rush of relief or triumph. In fact, he felt emptier than he had before. There was no real victory in this. It wasn't the ending he'd wanted, but it was the only ending that made sense. The next few weeks were a blur of change. Michael threw himself into work, pouring every ounce of his energy into his job, trying to fill the void left by the collapse of his marriage. But he couldn't escape the quiet moments, those brief, solitary seconds when his mind would wander back to the past. The life he had once imagined, the future he thought he was building, all of it was gone. But through the pain, something else began to emerge. Michael started to realize that the life he had been living wasn't the one he truly wanted. For years, he had allowed himself to be consumed by the idea of what his life should look like, dictated by the expectations of others. But now, with everything stripped away, he saw the opportunity for something new. One evening, he sat on his balcony, the city lights twinkling below him as he watched the sunset. It wasn't quite the freedom he had hoped for, but it was the freedom he had earned. The past was behind him, and now he had to face forward. There was nothing left to hold on to but the future. His future. The future he would create for himself, on his own terms. In the weeks that followed, Michael started to take steps toward rebuilding. He found a new rhythm to his life, spending time with old friends he hadn't seen in years. He took up hobbies he had long forgotten and started traveling to places he had always dreamed of visiting. There was still pain, of course. The echoes of his past relationship were never far, but the more he lived for himself, the more he realized that he was stronger than he had ever known. As for Emily, Michael never heard from her again. She moved away, as she had hinted, and though Michael didn't know the specifics, he hoped she found the peace she was searching for. It wasn't his concern anymore. He had made peace with the fact that sometimes people grow apart, and sometimes it's the best thing that can happen. The story wasn't just about betrayal. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about finding the courage to let go, to accept that things would never be the same again. Michael's journey was one of self-discovery, one where he learned that love and trust could be rebuilt. But not with someone who had torn them apart. He couldn't change the past, but he could shape his future. And with each passing day, that future grew brighter. Not because he had all the answers, but because he finally understood that he didn't need them. What mattered now was who he was becoming. As we close this chapter of Michael's story, we're reminded that life isn't always fair. Sometimes we face betrayal, heartbreak, and challenges we never saw coming. But it's how we respond to those moments that defines us. Michael chose to reclaim his life. He chose to let go and move forward, and in doing so, he found his own strength. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you've enjoyed this story, be sure to hit that like button, share with your friends, and subscribe to my channel for more gripping stories. Your support means the world, and I can't wait to share more with you. Until next time, take care, and remember, your story is just beginning.